Once again, autumn approaches our doors and the nights are filled with screams of agony, with cries of terror and misguided fools trying to catch a glimpse at what is hidden behind the veil of our ordinary reality. Once again we find blood clots at the back of our throats, nails digging right behind our eyes, piercing sounds scratching and tearing our skin until all that is left is a story untold. Once again it is time for us to lock ourselves in our bedrooms, with darkness's embrace leading us towards our avatar's demise. Once again it is time for Halloween. The red pulsating thread of horror has been a constant throughout all of humanity's history. Where it used to be man feared animals and worshipped them as gods, in fear of incredible punishment, man soon found higher forms of life to be much more horrifying. The constant unease at the hands of the omnipotent unknown led us to construct and deconstruct our morals, our modern civilization and everything we held dear. Man painted his fears on walls and caves and soon found other tapestries to display their overbearing primal fears. Everybody knows the children's tales of the Brothers Grimm, folkloric stories of death, resurrection, torture, child abuse and despair. Folklore evolved to Gothic horror and is to this day remembered with classics like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Bram Stoker's Dracula or Matthew Lewis's The Monk. They were then followed by the likes of H.P. Lovecraft's work and subsequently more science-focused horror stories, though the supernatural still remains a strong background for the more modern tales. Nowadays we can claim that every medium we use has been touched by horror's icy grip, and that of course includes our main topic on this channel, video games. But first of all, what is horror? Is it the fear of death? We can give you that. Is it the fear of loss? Easily accessible. Is it something more specific? Claustrophobia, the fear of the dark? We got you covered. Whatever you fear, we can produce. There is one main catch though, where our ancestors had to use their imagination to be confronted by their fears. We can actually experience every monster by ourselves. And nothing is more sobering than facing something that seemed that much more terrifying in our head. Whilst H.P. Lovecraft's description of the laws of physics being torn apart kept us shivering in our beds, Portal's actual depiction of space-time bending amused us. So how do we force horror back into our bedrooms? How do we stretch video games in such a way that every truth we hold dear crumbles right before our feet? In his book Danse Macabre, Stephen King suggested 3 levels that more or less cover most of horror, and these can also be partially applied to video games. They are namely terror, horror, and revulsion. Terror is the feeling of unease, the sensation that somehow, somewhere, death is lurking, waiting for you to make a mistake and punish you. It's that dreaded feeling you get in Outlast when you know someone's there, but you don't know where. It's that lingering sensation in Dark Souls where every step could be your last and you can never fully gauge your enemy's strength. It's that panic in Resident Evil when you realize you wasted all your ammo and don't know what's coming next. This is of course the hardest level to achieve, as it mostly stems from the player's own minds. While one part of your brain is focused on playing the game, the other one is focused on everything that could go wrong, focused on everything that's on the line. It is exactly this feeling that pushes a game from mediocre to great. If the stakes are low, why even bother playing? If everything is easy to achieve, is it really worth it? Lack of terror is the reason why games like Battlefield or Assassin's Creed are more and more looked at with disdain, with their constant checkpoints and overabundance of ammunition and resources. How do we achieve terror though? Like I mentioned before, it is mostly constructed within our own heads. The player has to expect an event that he doesn't want to experience, be it a jump scare or the loss of progress. It's the reason why in Dead Space, as you get more powerful, the game feels less and less scary. It's the same reason why in Payday you start to panic on the third day when one of your partners just went to jail. Developers are able to give their games more weight simply by not constantly holding your hand. Of course, there's a fine line between necessary and unnecessary punishment, but that is not what I'm trying to discuss here. Simply put, if you give us less resources, less checkpoints, less security, it will surely make your game that much more intense. Horror is the moment of truth. Horror is the ear-tearing scream that came out of nowhere. Horror is the realization that you just lost 20 minutes of progress. It's the panic felt while being pulled out of a locker. Horror is basically the jump scare. While terror led up to this point, it's the sensation of horror that most modern, horror games are based on. There has been a recent resurgence of games focused on a good atmosphere, focused on terror, but we have seen more and more games that simply rely on jump scares and cheap tricks to shock you for a second or two. While not necessarily bad, it is a mechanic that can lose its impact very soon and should be used only sparingly, otherwise it might turn off the player simply because the effect has worn off. Finally, there is revulsion, and boy isn't that a topic in itself. Revulsion is just what it is. It's the gag reflex, it's the disgusting things found throughout old basements and abandoned buildings. But is it applicable to games anymore? I would claim that nowadays no it isn't. Almost every action game features at least minor amounts of blood and gore, and this has gotten us more and more used to it. Few games nowadays manage to actually fill us with disgust, because the depiction of violence is so standard in modern video games. For it to mean something again, games would have to take a step back and see how common blood currently is. Still, in horror games it can help set up the mood, set up the scene and underline what this is all about in the end. Now of course all of this can be emphasized by one simple feeling, which could also be covered while talking about terror, but I think it needs a special mention. I am of course talking about impotence, frailty, helplessness. It's not enough for you to know that you might die any second. You need to be aware of the fact that, in the end, you had no other choice. Once again, it is a fine line between too hard and just enough, but giving your character an uncontrollable weakness can add so much to a game. The amount of themes covered in horror games could be expanded upon just by adding a simple character flaw. Simply think of how we perceive war in video games. It is nothing but a backdrop to show your incredible skills while destroying the enemy. How come that horror games have never touched the horror that is part of every war? Imagine, if you're so inclined, a military hospital. A horribly disfigured soldier lies in the corner. He lost his hands in the war that is still going on all around him. The base gets attacked and he manages to flee without any help, but still powerless. Imagine being that soldier. Or imagine the apocalypse, not knowing if you're the only survivor, trying to find enough resources to survive from day to day and hoping to meet other people. But the only thing there is this shadow in the corner of your eyes, the sound of a breaking twig, fresh, blood-drenched footsteps. Almost any theme can be turned into horror, and hopefully game developers will try out more and more to conquer our fears and use them against us. Hopefully horror games get the attention they deserve and don't wither and die, while we're all saving the world instead of ourselves. Or maybe we should let horror games die. Let them rot somewhere in an unkempt graveyard, so that they can rise again covered in maggots and filth, looking for you, no matter where you are. You know they're coming. Can you hear the knocking? I know I can. And I don't know what it means.